They want unity, and I think unity is way overrated. You throw an empty slogan like "Kullun yani kullun." I mean, one of the main pillars of Lebanon, which distinguishes it from the region, is that we have a power sharing system. Banking system in Lebanon had huge losses. If you want violence, go to Latin America and see what violence means. And you often have the rise of fascism, and the collapse is total. The truth is very hot. We are not alone suffering this. We deserve the credit for managing it without killing each other.
For me, this is an honor for many reasons. The first is we got to know each other for the last decade or so as friends, but also as my preferred podcast guest. And it's a delight to have you as the first guest on the MTV podcast that I'm hosting, at least this day of the week. There's a lot to talk about. I think if we didn't have time constraints, we could be here for 3 days talking. So I'll try to curtail as much as we can. I think the both of us discuss an issue that impacts both of us in different ways. It's this generational divide that we both frequently talk about. And for anyone that doesn't know you, I'm sure the audience would know you right away. But in case anyone's tuning in and doesn't know you, you're Nadim Shehadi, an economist by training. You're a regular writer at Arab News. You're a former executive director of LAU New York. You have many different outfits. I think anyone can search you. They'll see Chatham House. They'll see the director of the Ferris Center at the Fletcher School in Tufts. But right now, I think I could best describe you as a thinker. And your thoughts are quite eloquent, expressed regularly in Arab News. But the generational divide, I think, transcends all your work. And let's go there. You often refer to yourself as, I wouldn't say dinosaur, but maybe out of step, perhaps, with the younger generation's views on this country. I don't see myself necessarily as the younger anarchist-like.
You're an in-betweenie.
I'm an in-betweenie, yes. Let's go down this road together.
Yeah.
Why do you think of Lebanon that way? And perhaps we can explore those differences a bit at length. How you see your views maybe disconnected to a degree from the younger, more politics, protest-driven youth momentum, especially since October 17.
Yes, well, it's thank you, Awalshi, for and I hope you haven't raised expectations too many. It's always better to start with low expectations when you're.
It's hard to do that with you.
But started earlier. It started in 2016 with the You Stink movement, and with the general definition of what people call civil society here. There was almost an ideological definition of civil society. Civil society are non-sectarian, almost secularist. They're sort of on the left, whereas civil society is basically not the state, when it should be varied and have different opinions. It was almost like a doctrine to be part of civil society. And what was worrying in the protests, especially in the October protests, was the almost nihilism of the younger generation, and the description of Lebanon as a failure from the start, from 1920. And it was almost like they wanted to destroy the whole edifice. It was like, one of my predecessors at Chatham House said that civilizations are not killed; they commit suicide. And people jump before they are pushed in general. So there is this sense of total, absolute failure, which of everything Lebanese, that will describe the future, that will basically draw the future for Lebanon, and that's dangerous. And I think the divide is mainly because someone like me, a dinosaur, has experienced Lebanon in the 50s and 60s, well, in the 60s and 70s mainly. I was too young in the 50s and the late 50s, but so I know the good side and the bad side, and some people have, I mean, this generation have only experienced it since the 90s, which is the worst period, when there was a deep cultural change, and when the whole country and society was, as they say in spy movies, compromised, when it was, penetrated by Syrian mukhabarat and that sort of very different atmosphere than the pre-war.
Let me cherry pick as much as I can, because it's 7 decades or even longer of a story that doesn't have a common narrative. And there's divergence on where problems begin, where they end.
Absolutely.
The source, and I think that's debated existentially now on Lebanese outlets. If you allow me, let me start with something that just happened recently. 2 days ago from the time of this recording, February 14, 2023. It's 18 years after a massive shift, a massive change in Lebanese politics, but one that's defined by violence and political violence and assassination. One of the most tragic tales in modern Lebanese history that took the lives of 2 people we both know, Rafiq Hadidi and Bassel Flehan, among others, innocent victims. It felt like this anniversary, 18 years later, a handful, maybe even less, barely anyone was recognizing the damage done by that type of violence on Lebanese politics, economics, perhaps even bigger things, narrative, the way we understand this problem. We can even go deeper, identity. All these things, it seemed like it was missed. And it felt like, maybe that's part of the story, that there's I don't want to say amnesia, but maybe there is a generation that grew up in the post-Syria political disorder. Forget the Syrian occupation, it's post-Syrian withdrawal.
That's right.
That seems to be the bulk of voices that maybe are not able to reflect on the earlier years, let alone the 1950s and 60s. More in the date itself, that it went without any serious discussion. It went with a whimper.
You mean this day, 2 days ago? Yeah, a few days ago.
Well, what, February 14?
Yes, February 14, yeah.
Not necessarily March 14th, February 14.
February 14, yeah.
Why that's not really being discussed the way it should be. A verdict happened, a whole special tribunal happened, an investigation happened, yet missing from the discussion.
Well, this is even more significant because it followed a call by major human rights organizations in the country and legal organizations and even private sector organizations for an international investigation of the port blast. Now, I mean, there are many challenges to such an investigation, for such an investigation to happen. But the main thing is our credibility. How can we ask the world for help with an investigation when they responded to us 15 years ago, 17, 18 years ago, and they conducted a very extensive investigation for several years and set up a tribunal and a trial, and there were, the country went through huge upheavals because of it, caused by it, and more than 27 countries contributed in funding and expertise and all that, and yet when the results came, we dismissed it. We fell for the anti-tribunal propaganda. They won. They cancelled the result of the tribunal, which I think was extremely significant. In Lebanese history, this is the first time we have the truth, and the truth is probably far more important than achieving justice, if you like. because putting a couple of people in jail is never justice. It's
But let's go down
the
that
truth
road a little
is more
further.
important.
Is
But
that part of the generational divide, meaning that you and I know what happened? We're old enough to know the consequences of what happened.
yeah,
Is there anything in not being able to fully appreciate what that did to politics, and just in terms of age, that maybe the younger crowd doesn't care? It's not part of their time.
I'm not sure. I'm not qualified to do a psychological analysis for this.
Mm,
But there are historians. I mean, there's a whole field of the culture of defeat.
mm,
You know, uh, 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 Bismarck's Germany, the rise of Germany, was the result of a defeat several decades earlier by Napoleon.
mm,
Um, the European society was completely transformed by Bismarck's rise.
mm,
People,
mm,
I mean, we can go into a lot of it, but the impact of the American Civil War, the impact of World War II, the impact. So defeats create a certain culture where people re-examine themselves, and all the traumas, they are often described as traumas of the defeat, are manifested in society. And I think one of the traumas of the young generation is to be political. They want unity, and I think unity is way overrated. It's better to be divided. It's better to argue. It's the richer
You know what? Let's
to
go
be
down the
that.
road. Let's marry psychology with unity.
So if you name a political party, then you're taking sides. You're playing politics. So if politics is dirty, you don't want to play politics. You throw an empty slogan like "Kullun yani kullun," which is avoiding the subject. So
But
that's
let's go down that road. I like that you acknowledge you're not a psychologist or a psychiatrist, but you've eloquently talked about trauma in a way that could damage politics permanently.
yeah,
Let's marry that with unity. I can imagine a generation that grows up in this country that knows nothing but national unity.
yeah,
And they see that as not necessarily a consequence of something bigger, but rather the standard. So I'll try to unlayer that.
yeah,
A generation that does not care if the unity is done through violence or not. A generation that doesn't really appreciate perhaps the sacrifices that were made prior to that, whether it's the March 14, 2005 era or those years thereafter, where there was a struggling, nascent post-Syria state unable to deliver much due to that violence. National unity, it's interesting. The Civil War is 15 years long. Doha Agreement is 15 years old. And we're approaching a
yeah.
15-year marker of national unity and what that can
Yes.
do.
From
So is that part of it, that a generation could blame everyone for everything because that's all they know? Everyone is in cahoots. Unlike the generation that you grew up in, which saw a struggle of ideas, or perhaps even ideologies at play.
yeah. Yes, I mean that's very, 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 very interesting. I mean, let me add one concept which we deeply disagree on.
The sacred cow.
Your sacred cow, exactly, which is sovereignty.
Mm.
These concepts like unity, sovereignty, equality, secularism, or anti all these anti-sectarianism, all these are in a way sort of virtue signaling. They're positive concepts which you cannot argue with. You can't argue against these things, but they're being used in the wrong way, to totally destroy the whole history of the country. And there are four pillars. I mean, one of the main pillars of Lebanon, which distinguishes it from the region, is that we have a power sharing system. Nobody else has it, and they call it sectarianism, which is it's not. It's a communal power sharing. It's a social contract that preceded the state, which created in Lebanon. It's the social contract that created the state, not the state that created the social contract. So the social contract is stronger than the state itself. The state has collapsed, but the social contract is still there amongst people. So that needs to be abolished for some Jacobin secularist neo-Baathist formula. We had a banking system which
But let
nobody
me. I
else
have
had.
to interrupt because I know I can with you. It's
Yeah,
usually
thanks.
fun.
Yeah.
I don't think the common protester sees that Machiavellian way of defining themselves as like they're Marxists or they're.
No, no, no.
I mean,
Yeah,
I don't think. I think they're just extremely angry.
yeah.
So I mean, I don't think they turn to the Ba'ath Party for inspiration.
No,
Yeah,
I'm just provoking.
I
Yeah,
know. I
I'm
know.
just being
Yeah.
provocative. Yeah. No, I'm just saying that. I mean, it's a big subject, but
Sure. Yeah.
I mean, secularism in the region has produced the worst possible systems but I mean, they're against the banking system.
I don't know. Okay. I have to defend the younger crowd, even though I'm not the younger crowd.
Yes. Okay.
Again, I don't think
It's a big responsibility, you know.
it's. I mean, I'm too old maybe to stand up for the teenager, but
Yeah.
I don't think they think of secularism that way either. Meaning, they see it function in ways that make sense to them, not in the region, but they see it. I mean, we know we've grown up with this globalization that now we can see the world from Beirut,
Hmm.
and we see versions of secularism that do appeal from here at least. I think that's what they think of, that they stand up for things that they want,
Mhm.
not what has failed in this part of the world.
Yeah.
So let me at least defend them in that. But I agree with you, pluralism in Lebanon has its huge advantages. And I agree with you that they don't necessarily see that as an advantage today.
Yeah.
So I know I interrupted you, but I'll let you carry on.
Okay. Let's cut it I mean, to the conclusion.
Mm.
Conclusion is that they need to re-examine all these concepts. There was the initial revolutionary fervor and the destructive ideas and the anger and the soul searching and everything. But something positive has to come out of it, and I don't see yet anything positive coming out of it. And they are confused.
Mm.
I mean, most people are more confused. I mean, the situation is confusing. I've been trying to explain it in several articles, but I'm not convinced myself that I have the answer. You have everyone accusing everyone of causing
The catastrophe.
the catastrophe.
Yeah.
So they need to make sense. They need to have a clearer view of the future. It has to be it's probably different from our view, and it should be, but it has to look at a positive future rather. Otherwise, they're driving themselves out of the country. They're leading themselves to be completely disillusioned, putting up straw man that they cannot defeat, and then they will say, "Okay, we give up," and they leave. And I've seen a lot of them, of people like that abroad.
So we're going to get into some of these articles, but you mentioned there's four. Power sharing is one, and the compromise angle was the second one. What was
The
third?
banking system
The banking system.
and political. We have a political system. We have political parties. We have different representation. Some are purely sectarian, some are not. Some are different nationalisms. We have a diverse political system, political society, with political parties, and they dismiss all the political parties.
Well, the news that this morning, February 16,
Yeah.
Thursday, this morning, we both wake up to see news of banks being attacked.
Being attacked. Yeah.
I believe only in Badaro, if I'm not mistaken. But the images of tires burning and glass shattered and people demanding their life savings or anything,
Sure.
and they're letting it out. When you see that, are you seeing a revolt against the banking system, or are you seeing protesters demanding accountability? Because I lean more to the latter. I don't think of them as challenging the banking system. I think of them as trying to survive.
Yeah, but banks are an easy target. Bankers are not the most palatable of people. Their reputation is of greed and bling. If you like.
You're talking universally.
Universally, yeah. So legally speaking, they put their money in the banks. And they're trying to get their money in the banks. So it's the obvious explanation that the banks have stolen our money, which I don't think is correct. I mean, the banking system in Lebanon had huge losses. I mean, there were about 32 or 34 billion in debts to the banks that were repaid to the banks in dollars, uh, between 20 and 10 and 15, 20% of their value. That's a loss. That's a real loss to the bank, which they cannot repay later.
But I'm speaking more in the generational divide, the way you're more insecure to see these banks being attacked and the younger protesters that are so eager to break in. Does it fall into that?
It doesn't need a lot of logic to understand that if you destroy the banking system, you destroy your money goes away with it. The banking system. Our money is in the banks. You destroy the banks, you destroy the deposit, and you destroy deposits too, and you destroy the banks by bankrupting.
What I hear from you, and I'll let you get to the fourth one as well, but what I hear from you is that they're unintentionally or maybe inadvertently destroying what to you represents a better Lebanon in the process. That by doing that, their anger could be legitimate. It could be actually.
It is legitimate.
And a legitimate sign of almost revenge at a system that failed them, for all the reasons we can get into. But perhaps in the background, you're seeing the better part of Lebanon fading as well with that. That maybe this kind of low-level violence is a threat to the Lebanon you.
It's very low-level violence, and it's very isolated. I wouldn't judge the whole revolt by a couple of incidents like that. And I want to go back to something you said in the beginning, that we've had 15 years of violent. We've had a revolt of 15 years and 15 years of violence. We have not. We've had 15 years of almost peaceful resistance in Lebanon.
You're talking about Doha years, the last 15?
Yes. The violence was the last 18, sorry, I'm a bit, since 2005, there was a revolt in 2005, which is a peaceful revolt. And there was it was confronted by violence, provoking a war, occupying the city, May 7, all these declaration of war every year, assassination after assassination, all this is violence on society. But society has not responded by violence. In the sense...
Oh, I see. You mean up until since the economic collapse?
Even that, we haven't had violence. I mean, if you want violence, go to Latin America and see what violence means in a society which crumbles and where people lose their money and
So you're emphasizing the word violence on the team that I think we would both see eye to eye, that hijacked politics and hijacked...
And using violence to hijack the country and to block the country and paralyze the country and to continuously batter the society and the state to such an extent that in the end it finally collapsed.
We'll save that for...
That's how I describe it. But I mean, if we compare, we're neighbors with Syria. We're facing the same sort of enemy, if you like, or system. We're opposing the same. In Syria, they started with non-violence and they turned into violence. And they lost too. So we, at least the Lebanese society, did not collapse into a civil war in confrontation with the violence that we've had. And instead, we used compromise after compromise after compromise, which led us to collapse anyway. But I think it's important to note that we did not go into violence.
We can save that for later, because I think that angle reflects on many things we've both witnessed in recent years, including the aftermath of the port blast and why there's no momentum to investigate, at least right now. But let's save that for a bit later. The fourth pillar, which I find interesting, political parties.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that? when you say political parties from the earlier generations versus the more fluidity today, w- why do you think of that as necessarily something? I sense a bit of care when you talk about the political parties, that there's still something critical, even if they're flawed.
Yes, I mean all politicians are flawed. I mean, as you know, except people we are close to. That's no. I mean politicians, politicians and bankers. Let's not try and defend either, but or put ourselves in that position. But they are necessary. I mean, in a political system, there are politicians, and our politicians, some are bad, some are worse. Uh, uh, Politicians are bad, in my view. Anyway, I mean, it's a prerequisite, a certain amount of corruption and a certain amount of narcissism is the minimum requirement to enter that
I
subject.
don't know if I can go down that road in a blanket statement against all
No,
politicians, but let's
no, I'm
assume.
starting with
Yeah.
I'm starting with that to
Mm,
tell you that I acknowledge
mm.
th- that aspect of the
Mm.
kullun yani kullun
Okay. Right.
uh, uh, slogan, but politicians are a necessary component of a democratic society, and we cannot dismiss the whole. I mean, during the revolts and during the elections, you saw resistance to any alliance with any former political party or anybody connected to any political party. It's like complete dismissal of the political side. These are dangerous signs
Mm.
because after catastrophes like these, after defeats like these, you often have the rise of fascism. I mean, we've seen it in Europe, we've seen it in many places, we've seen it in Turkey, we've seen it in
That's not in the mix in in October 17. I don't think
well,
fascists are.
it's not, but when you destroy political society, destroy the institutions, this nihilism can easily lead to the rise of a leader which will say, I have the solution to everything, and we have seen attempts, people who tried to
We've seen attempts and we've seen how
I'm glad they
marginalized,
failed,
but we see how marginalized they become in a
which
very
is
short period
a
of
good
time.
sign. Which is a
Yeah,
good sign. It wasn't that short. I mean, I was surprised.
they're not.
We've agreed not to name names, Mahek. We'll do the naming later.
No, but even the ones that have all the answers in their minds, their traction is marginal today, especially after the elections that we saw last
Yes.
year, late in May. But in terms of political parties, the way you describe them, I'm trying to get past. I'm trying to bring these two things together. You see the younger crowd today less interested in political parties. Is that how you're phrasing it?
In total dismissal of political, we're talking about the Thawrajiyya, Mahek.
We're talking about
The slogans of the Thawrajiyya and the
or no, it could
that
be
general culture.
just all of the above, meaning the younger society as we know it, from supporters of the regime to opponents of the regime
Yeah.
to October 17, all of that. Do you see that there's a general, perhaps more wider trend to dismiss political parties too quickly? Because I hear you,
Yeah.
it's almost like you're trying to preserve something.
No, I mean, even political parties are trying to ride that wave. I mean, you've seen the key political parties that are being opposed,
Yeah.
pretending to be part of the Thawra now. So it's a good sign, yani, that they're gaining that momentum. But I don't understand what the final outcome in their vision is, or if it's at all formulated, or if it is just, uh, I mean, I've called it suicide, but where they're driving themselves into a corner where their only option is to leave and never come back once they have no more family and no more and that's that's the way history moves. I mean,
This is interesting. So you're seeing the decaying and perhaps potential death of a Lebanon that you remember in your lifetime that does not match the Lebanon of today. Allow me to make this a bit more personal from your side,
yeah.
if you'd let me. When you were growing up in the pre-Civil War years, and the way you saw politics changing in this country, and not necessarily for the better back then, did you find yourself feeling the same way? Or was that Lebanon something that maybe did not resonate with you at the time? I'm trying to see if
Yeah.
you are seeing Lebanon more as a, if you will, it's almost like the historic narrative as opposed to you and how your place in this country
No,
feels.
because I'm an insignificant player in this whole thing. And when I grew up, I was totally apolitical.
Oh,
I
okay.
never, when there were demonstrations, I walked in both because I had friends in both. And I'm from Ras Beirut, where there is very little politics, and I was totally unconscious of it. I mean, even my studies were nothing to do
Mm,
with,
mm.
with Lebanon. I ended up by accident making a career in it. In
So your younger self
My younger self was totally
was not
oblivious.
politically charged at all.
Not at all. No, no.
Interesting.
But I was surrounded by people who were politically charged, and
Right.
I had friends who were,
Mm, mm.
Arab nationalists and Islamists and Hizb al-Ba'ath and Hizb al-Awmi.
Then do this back to the future moment. You saw division there playing itself out, and today you're seeing unity paralyzing all that is Lebanon, but unity not in a good way, and unity in the worst way possible, which is really the last 17 to 18 years
Yeah,
of modern Lebanese history and
they
all of the above.
imposed unity. They imposed, yeah,
Imposed unity. Let me try to go,
which is against politics.
which is against politics. I agree with you on
Yeah,
that. Let's try to match the terrain with articles you've written on this. Maybe start with the most recent article, which talks about
I'm sure.
international protection in
Yeah,
history.
yeah,
And it's, I think, a careful, cautious dismissal of neutrality on its own. It's more in international protection is the thing that matters more.
yes,
And you mentioned the sacred cow earlier of sovereignty.
that's right.
I think neutrality is attached to that phrase too.
Yeah,
I'll play devil's advocate naturally because I think we have a disagreement on that point. But let's talk about at least the merits of international protection, the way you see it playing out.
okay.
Your pieces, particularly in Arab news, go back in time, and they go back to Ottoman years. And quite frequently, you're a very eloquent storyteller. In the written word, you find ways of bringing up merchant families that arrive from Alexandria. You often link Beirut and its neighborhoods to various cities in the region too.
Yeah,
And I don't think I know anyone else that can do it as persuasively as you do. You're trying to remind us of recent history, but not the last 15 years. It's more like the last 200 years, the last 2 centuries. When you say international protection right now, does that lump in all the attempts at countering violence, the way we see politics being destroyed? In other words, the port blast is unsolvable here. Hariri's assassination would have been
absolutely.
unsolvable here. This string of political assassinations that killed people we know, in my case, my own father, that kind of investigation cannot happen here. This is a level that Lebanon cannot handle.
Yeah,
Not necessarily because Lebanon is flawed, but because Lebanon could be paralyzed, it could be destroyed by national unity, it could be Hezbollah and all that Hezbollah represents right now, it could be Syria in the older days, it could be anything. But that there's a layer above that has guaranteed some normality to this country. So let me go down that road with you. But you choose as much as you want to go back in time. I don't want to take it too
yeah.
far back.
We don't have much time. Let
Obviously,
me
we don't.
summarize.
Yeah,
Let me summarize it
yeah. But
as
keeping
a concept
protection in
because
mind, what it means
yeah,
to you.
look, protection is very simple. If you are a small country with very cosmopolitan and diverse and non-nationalist. I mean, we inherited Ottoman cosmopolitanism, which And we attracted the those merchant families I always talk about, and others, and artists and intellectuals from Smyrna, from Aleppo, from Adana, from Egypt, from Mosul, from Baghdad, from everywhere. Beirut was that hub. That's what caused the prosperity and the richness of society, and at the expense of us not being nationalists. When I grew up, I was not aware that these were foreigners. And these were normal. It was normal to have Aleppans in your class and neighbors who were from somewhere else. And this is what a cosmopolitan society is. Nationalism kills killed this spirit. And such a society, because does not rely on an army to protect it. It relies more on diplomatic, on diplomacy, on international protection, like a merchant in Ottoman days would have several medals when he goes and sees the pasha, and these medals would mean you can't mess with me because I have the medal of Saint Ignatius and Saint whatever, and the Austrians and the French and the Prussians and all will come after you. It's the same. So Lebanon was protected in that sense. So it was not neutral. It was of one camp. It was protected by the West. It was protected by,
we're talking
French.
Pre-independence, clearly, pre-mandate, independence.
No, even after independence. If you read the articles of the sort of the founding fathers or that generation, they were conscious that France and Britain were losing their place in the world, and that America was the rising power, and they deliberately cultivated relations with America, with whom they had absolutely no contact, almost. Other than the missionary stuff. They chose an ambassador to go there to build that kind of protection back on Lebanon, and you can almost, if you look at Lebanese history from that angle, you can almost pinpoint the hour and the minute when protection collapsed and when protection was regained, and how effective it is. I'll give you just one example. In June 2004, Normandy Day.
Okay.
Yeah, Normandy Day. After 15 years of Lebanon being completely outside the radar, no protection at all, Syria being given completely free hand in the country, no interference, nobody mentions anything Syria does. June 2004, Chirac met with George Bush and told him, let's bury our differences over Iraq. If you want democracy in Iraq, why not democracy everywhere? Why not democracy in Lebanon? Why did you sacrifice Lebanon to Syria in 1990 for the sake of Iraq, and now for the sake of Kuwait? And now, if you've suddenly realized why can't, and that's how 1559 was born. And in the next year, there were like 24 resolutions on Lebanon and several initiatives, and
so when you say international
so
protection,
that was the return of that was in a way the return of protection. You can pinpoint the minute they met. You can even get pictures of it. And you can pinpoint the minute they lifted that protection.
But I heard you say diplomacy earlier.
Yes.
So diplomacy, you mean, in other words, that Lebanon is spared. Is that what I understand from you? That
no, Lebanon is in a way. In local language, they call it that there's a mazalli or an umbrella over. Over that's how it's described in the press on
but I'm hearing that it's spared from what could tear it apart or paralyze it,
from
meaning
being taken over by
but typically regional,
by the bully of the region, yes. Right. Whether it's Abdel Nasser or Arafat or Assad or Nasrallah.
But then to me, that naturally extends to the word neutrality having some merit in this country, meaning that neutrality is the
Yes,
is
I'm
the
glad you raised that because we're not going to name names, but there's an argument about neutrality which I've heard recently that in order to for Hezbollah to give up
mm,
its arms, you have to reconstitute a
mm,
state which is neutral, which is sovereign, which is just, which is and for the state to be sovereign, it has to have no arms and only the arms in the state. So in order to achieve the conditions for Hezbollah to disarm, you have to disarm Hezbollah in the first place. It's like a circular argument, and you have to be neutral between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And as though there's an equivalence between Iranian uh, uh, in, the Iranian role in Lebanon and the role of the Gulf countries on which for me is
we don't need to name names, but that
yeah,
sounds like everyone from the opposition group and the majority of the change MPs.
yes,
So is that what you're referring to,
yeah.
the standard notion of what neutrality means? And you
You,
don't see eye to eye with
that's
that.
not neutrality. That's isolation. That's complete. A
Mm,
sovereign country,
mm,
in that sense, has its alliances, chooses the side it's on, and it's protected by those alliances and and it's enriched by the sides, by its partners. You trade with your partners.
mm.
I mean, you have economic relations, you have alliances, you have support. Uh, that's what a sovereign country is. It's totally unsovereign, if you like, to say, okay, we're not going to talk to anybody, we're going to isolate ourselves, we're going to shrink the banking system because we're overbanked, and we only need 2 or 3 local banks. There are
You he-
credible people who say this.
you hear that from the neutrality-minded.
I hear that from some so-called economists.
So this is where,
And I hear that from neutrality
mm,
people, yes.
well then, I mean, I'm not.
No,
Maybe I'm
no,
not.
yeah.
Maybe I'm clearly we're not the same age. You have a few decades ahead of me in terms of
Stop rubbing it
perspective.
in.
We're almost the same. No, you're a little
Yeah.
older.
All right.
But you referred to the '60s as your childhood, or that's the
Yeah.
Lebanon that you reflect on.
Yeah.
That to me is the closest we got to this experiment, meaning
Yeah.
a sovereign enough state, a neutral enough policy, and maybe I'm wrong, but I still hold on to this, despite what the younger crowd believes. That is the model. That is the template that works best for this country, where it is in a region that is violent, a region that is unstable, but Lebanon
Let me take you further
is
back.
shining.
Let me take you further back.
That to me is neutrality, a modicum of sovereignty, maybe not full, but it's close.
Yeah.
And I don't want to marry this to Fuad Shehab necessarily, but it's the conditions that were set forth and silly things that people talk about all the time, but they're important. Fuad Shehab Abdel Nasser meeting at the Syrian border,
Yeah.
the United Arab Republic border, little to no violence during the 1967 war between the Lebanese-Israeli border.
Yeah.
Actually, no violence along the border. That says to me a success. Lebanon, it's not protected the way you're defining it, but from within there's a notion of shielding itself.
Yes. But let me take you.
That's sovereignty and neutrality.
That's a sovereign country choosing its alliances and making pacts and putting itself in a firmly in one camp and having a pact with the other. So it's not neutrality between the West and the East. We didn't isolate ourselves and say, okay, we're not going to talk to the Americans, we're not going to talk to the Saudis, we're not going to talk to any
I don't think
Gulfies.
that's isolation.
That's isolation.
Yeah.
I can send you the YouTube video where this has been spelled out.
Isolation rather than.
Well, it translates into isolation, and it was spelled. I mean, it's being spelled out in a very crude sectarian manner, like the Shias have to give up Iran, and the Sunnis have to give up Saudi Arabia, and the Christians have to give up France, which is very cliche on, you know, even though I'm the last sectarian in the country, but it's
I don't. I think that's maybe taking it to the extreme. I think I
it
could
is
be
it
wrong.
is extreme.
Yeah, but I.
You have to take ideas to their extreme to see where they lead to find the flaws in them. Otherwise, they're empty slogans, they're virtue signaling, and they just words that sound good, but they could lead you to the abyss.
That's an interesting way of dissecting what I thought of, and I still do
Mm.
mostly, the well-intentioned of the ex-opposition and
Yeah.
many, not necessarily all, but many that claim to represent change in this country, that they do stand for the better, uh, better consequences of neutrality. I'd never heard isolation coming out of their rhetoric, but
I
it
see
may.
it as I see
Yeah,
it.
no, that's interesting. I appreciate the way you take ideas to their limits too. I think that's a mental exercise that's not necessarily done enough
Mm.
in the Lebanese sphere. Let me jump to
Yeah.
the more recent article, which was not about protection, but it was about paralysis
Yeah.
and the consequences of paralysis. Um, we between us, we talk about that word frequently. I think both of us actually refer to that word. Could you, in a nutshell, describe paralysis the way you understand it, transcending Lebanese politics, economics, society? When that word comes up and you're thinking through a paralyzed state, not the psychological stuff, more the
No.
on the ground politics, if you will.
Yeah.
What does that mean to you in a nutshell, paralysis?
Yeah, I'm not sure I have a final answer, but
Mm,
but I wrote two pieces.
mm,
Was the result of this. I mean, I called several friends who were psychologists about how trauma
mm,
behaves and how people in abusive relationships and all that, and I also called engineers and how do structures collapse and
mm,
so I was trying to find and and basically Lebanon was paralyzed. It's almost like it's called death by a thousand cuts.
mm,
It's not a single one can kill you, but in the end, the constant pounding, the constant battering, uh, weakens the structure and it's unable to resist anymore, and that's the paralysis that makes it crumble, and the collapse is total. It's economic, it's social, it's psychological, it's physical, it's everything. That's how bad the
So it's the
situation.
slow disintegration.
It's a slow. No, the disintegration is happens. Uh, when like in bridges or that are
Right.
that
Cracks that just
yeah,
over
or
time.
the Boeing where the screws get
Yeah.
through small vibrations.
Mm,
In the end, they give in and
mm,
explode. So we've been subjected to this. I mean, it wasn't vibration. I mean, every assassination was paralytic. I mean, I lived through it. Every time the phone rang, every time the door slammed, we jumped and thought, who. We were paralyzed and traumatized for several years by that. Then we had the paralysis of the city being occupied. Then we had 29 months to be precise, of no parliament, no government, and no president. And people expect uh, an economic and financial or a monetary policy to emerge in a condition like this you can't make decisions. You can't make. Um, it was total gradual, slow, uh, traumatic disintegration, which made the structure collapse completely.
I'd like to go as far as we can within the shortest period of time in addressing how paralysis lent itself to a generation with impunity as standard practice, culminating in the port blast and the inability to do anything about this.
Yes.
I think it's an argument worth having, although I stand firmly in one side, which is there is no capability left for any local investigation worth anything,
True.
despite the well intentions of someone like Tariq Bitar or anyone in his place. There are set limits. Some of those limits have been made public via threats. Some of them are whispers in the background, but it doesn't matter. There's a limit, and we're approaching 2.5 years, if not actually 2.5 years, of inability to do anything about the largest non-nuclear blast in modern history. I fully endorse the other side of the argument, which is you need to have the internationalization of this issue
Yeah.
for it to generate something. And you mentioned the truth earlier being as important or perhaps more important than justice.
Yeah.
For me, it's the first step.
Yeah.
It's the first step to getting any hint of accountability, and that whole journey is one of justice. Do you share the sentiment that local aspirations, local politics, local accountability, local judicial authority is meaningless today because of that very long generation of growing up, living through extreme paralysis turned collapse? Do you share that sentiment, or do you see anything worth maybe focusing in on? Because for me, it's all encompassing.
Yes, I mean, if I understand you correctly, what I think is also there is also an inability to make a decision on that. Even the call for the international investigation, which was done by five even major organizations. I think one of them was not part of was part of it, but then was not.
Oh, you're referring to the NGOs.
I'm referring to major international and local NGOs which deal with politics, with law, with human rights. They were calling for international investigation, but they were also expressing hesitancy in it being a interference in the sovereignty of the. It's unclear that they want. It's unclear what they want.
I think
and it's
that's
unclear.
psychological abuse of the word sovereignty. That's more pandering, perhaps, to have little to no consequence. I think that's
They're
a
afraid
misuse.
of being accused. I mean, that's not specify them, but people are. It's the same reason why people are afraid of using any terms. كلهم يعني كلهم as is the term. Everyone means something different by it, because they think politics is the cause, and politics is divisive. So they're not sure whether they want politics or not. It's complete confusion and paralysis, even in ideas on that. And that also is part of the rejection of the special tribunals and the rejection of the truth when they got it. I mean, the truth is very hot. It's very hot to handle. It's too hot to handle. But but it's there. They know, everybody knows the truth, even if they deny it. It's part of the general debate without being named.
But so in other words, short of an international curiosity and restructuring or rehabilitating the journey that was the special tribunal for Lebanon, we may well not see an end to this.
Let me give you. I mean, we're approaching the end, so let me just broaden this. We are not alone suffering this, or going through this. The whole region is going through aggression by a trans-regional criminal organization called the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps of Iran, which are active in Palestine, in Lebanon, in Syria, in Iraq, in Yemen, in Latin America, everywhere, and you cannot resolve the problem without seeing it in that perspective. So this problem is far bigger than us in a sense, and we deserve the credit for managing it without killing each other in the meantime, and not having another civil war, probably because of the memory of the last one. So we are a very valid society, a very strong state, a very strong state, but we have completely lost our self-esteem because we've been totally defeated, and we don't know what to do because we don't want to fight. We don't want to resort to violence. We don't want. We've tried compromise. It drove us further into the ditch, and that's where I see the confusion. And I hope that for I mean, well, it's not I hope. It's obvious to me that the answer to these questions that the next generation will come to will draw what the future is going to be in Lebanon. And history creates changes. There are places that disappear from that disappear, and there are places that grow, and cities that rise, and cities that fall, and so anything could happen from here. But it also depends on the way the Thawra, which we are talking about, perceives itself. They have a lot of energy, and they still do, even if they don't go on the street and all that. There's a lot of anger. They need to rethink it properly.
In terms of rethinking properly, I think it's a safe assumption on my side. You're the right person to not just balance the generational divide, or to always remember that the region and Lebanon, through history, through politics, through economic trade, through sociology, through anthropology, you find you have set the tone, I think, in a way that a younger person like me, who's not so young anymore, remembers a journey that I don't know. And I think the younger generation today benefits from someone like you still reminding us of our recent history and pointing at things that worked, and maybe removing the emotions that come with words like sectarianism and secularism, or any word that you want, sovereignty, neutrality. I think you have a way of neutralizing, sorry for the word, words that bring up emotions in this country. And I think it's a useful way of looking at Lebanon. I'll say something for MTV. Even in my own conversations with younger people that know that I'm now doing this for MTV, they don't remember that MTV was shut down for nearly a decade. MTV paid a price.
Of course. Yeah.
Paid a price under Syrian occupation. So for 10 years, there was no MTV during the March 14, 2005 protest. That, for me, is an important reminder that this is recent. So for that reason, it's an honor to do this for MTV.
Absolutely.
Post-October 17. It's an honor to have my first episode with you, Nadim Shehadi.
Thank you.
I know we'll be doing more on my own podcast. I hope to have you back on MTV as well. It's always a delight talking to you.
Thank you.
Thank you.